So I made this big end grain cutting board specifically for cutting a whole smoked packer sized brisket. And on the other side of the cutting board, I have a set of very deep juice grooves that I carved on the CNC machine. I made this out of scraps of leftover cherry, and when not in use, it hangs conveniently on the end of the island on these custom turned pegs. So over the last few projects, I seem to have accumulated quite a number of these big chunks of leftover cherry. I suppose it was 8/4. Looks like the thinnest is in the vicinity of 1 5/8 inches. So the first thing I'll do is plane it all down to 1 5/8 inches. Some of those chunks had some pretty severe cup or splits near the heart of the tree, so I first cut those out on the bandsaw. Then I made sure every piece was jointed on one face and one edge, planed them all down to a uniform thickness, and cut them into roughly square blanks on the table saw. Any scraps I just cut up on the miter saw, and those go in the bin waiting for the wood stove. Now with them all 1 5/8 inches square, I planed them all down to a uniform thickness in both directions. Then it's back to the miter saw to cut off any rough ends. With the blanks now all uniformly square, I then sort them roughly into equal lengths, and then I glue them up in sets of 6 using some Bessie K-body clamps. I'm a big fan of these clamps, and I have to say, as a woodworker, keep an eye on Facebook Marketplace and be prepared to jump on good deals when you see them. I bought a whole set of these clamps for about 1/4 what they'd cost at retail price. The glue I'm using here is Titebond 2. You could argue that I should be using Titebond 3, which has better waterproof properties. However, I have cutting boards that have stood up for over 20 years that I glued together with Titebond 2, so I'm not too worried about them standing up. And we just wait a few hours for the glue to dry. After maybe an hour or so, I usually come in with a cabinet scraper or a sibbler and scrape the rough glue off of one side. This makes it easier to run through the planer later. When feeding short boards through the planer like this, I try to keep them running continuously one after the other to avoid any snipe at the end of the board. That's where the cutter takes a little extra deep cut at the end of the planer feed. Now I move to the table saw to cut the blanks into short sections that will be turned up on edge to form the end grain cutting board. I'm using a large table saw crosscut sled that I use for cutting wide panels. And note that I've set up a stop block against the fence so that the offcuts don't bind against the fence as I cut each piece. At the end, I'm left with some short pieces that are too narrow to cut safely using the sled, so these I just cut very carefully against the rip fence. Note that I'm using a scrap block to hold the piece tight against the fence, and that my table saw has a riving knife that prevents the blank from getting caught by the back teeth of the saw blade. Even with that, I'm paying pretty careful attention with these cuts as there's a risk of kickback. So by keeping my original glue ups oriented and consistent and sort of alternating back and forth, I end up with kind of a consistent random pattern in the blocks. You probably saw I picked out a couple of lengths that I didn't like. And what I'm going to do is actually stick those chunks on either end, because what I want to do is I'm going to glue these up in 2 big blanks, and I'm going to run them through the planer. Again, my planer is not wide enough to do the whole thing, and I'll probably get some chip out on these last ones that I'll cut off later.
You can see that if you're doing many of these cutting boards, it definitely pays to buy your glue by the gallon. So at this point what I have is 4 small end grain cutting boards. I scrape the glue off one side, so I have a side that's fairly flat to run through the planer. I then chamfer one edge of each board to try to minimize the amount of blowout on the back end when I run it through the planer. I just got this new Grizzly planer that has a spiral head and carbide cutters, so I thought I'd see how it handled this end grain cherry. I have to say I was impressed. It seemed to handle it no problem, left a fairly clean surface, and had not too much blowout on the back edge. Here you see what I get fresh off the planer. I think I'll have to do less sanding than I've done in previous end grain cutting boards. Then I clean up the outside edges using the same crosscut sled I used earlier. Then, I joint one edge to get a clean glue line. Note that when I joint these, I mark one face at the joint, and then the mark goes outward for one board and then inward when I joint the next. With this little trick, even if your fence isn't perfectly square to the table, you'll end up with a clean glue line and a very flat top. Then it's back to the work table for glue up. Here I take care to try to get everything lined up really well, since I hope to avoid any more planing. So since I've made a variation of this cutting board before, I already have the program all set up to cut the juice grooves on my CNC machine, and I just need to modify it to fit the actual dimensions of this cutting board. The previous board was 25 by 17 3/4, and this one is 24 by 18, so it's just slightly different aspect ratio. And while I could sort of redraw everything, it's actually fairly easy to just simply take the whole part, say set select object size, and change it so it scales from the origin, and set it to 24 by 18. And noticing that I've got the don't link the X and Y aspect ratio, I want to be able to scale them independently, and say apply. There we go, that's my resized pattern. It's slightly distorted it, but I'm okay with that, that's not a big deal. This version, I actually don't want the 2 holes that I cut in it to hang it on a pegboard. That was very specific to my kitchen cutting board. I'm not going to make that for this one. And if I look at the CNC tool paths, that's these 2 tool paths I don't need as well. And then if I recalculate all the tool paths with the existing size and check my preview all the tool paths, we can see what the new cutting board is going to look like. So now it's ready to export this program and cut it on the CNC machine. So here's the cutting board with the grooves all cut. At this point, really all we have left is some sanding, with one exception. On the back side, which I want to have be a smooth surface, I was originally going to cut out this defect, but then I decided I wanted the full size that I had to make it 18 by 24. So I'm going to fill that with some colored epoxy. So it's the next morning and the epoxy fill is dry. It actually continued to soak into the board a little bit, so it's a little bit of a hollow. I think I'm going to proceed with sanding and finishing and see where we end up with after that. So next we'll quickly round over the edges with my trim router. Now all it's going to take is lots and lots of sanding. Okay, so we're all set up and ready to sand, including our string of sandpaper grits that we're going to work our way through. So with the sanding finally done, the last step is to make some finger grooves in the end of the board. I made a simple jig out of 3/4 inch plywood, which has a 5/8 inch by 4 inch slot cut in it. That slot serves as a guide for a bushing in the base of my plunge router, which holds the same 1/2 inch ball nose bit that I used to cut the grooves in the board on the CNC machine. Once the jig is ready, it's quick work to cut the finger slots in each end of the board. So after hours of sanding, finally the fun part, I built this little tray because I couldn't find a Rubbermaid style tray big enough for this cutting board.
I have a gallon of food grade mineral oil here, and it just goes right on top. I would say that it looks promising. So after soaking in the mineral oil bath for 24 hours, I've drained the bath back into this jug and recovered maybe 60% of the jug. So clearly it soaked up a lot of mineral oil. So here's the new cutting board beside the original prototype. You can see the original has gotten to be quite a bit richer, darker brown, as cherry will do over time. The new one's not quite as thick, and I didn't cut the juice grooves quite as deep. That was actually a mistake on the CNC machine the last time. Overall, I'm pretty happy with it. So I will just leave you with this picture to remind you of why I did this in the first place. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks for watching.